Welcome to our chapel here at Harris Manchester College and our inaugural Manchester lecture. This lecture series has its roots in our thinking together over the past few years about the college's sometimes surprising and often radical history, from its foundation in the 18th century as a dissenting academy for those who could not accept the dogma of any denomination, to its arrival in Oxford in the 1890s as an already coeducational college, to the present day when we seek to break down the barriers of age as a mature student college. We also began to explore the wide range of people who have been associated with the college, from the chemist Joseph Priestley, who was one of our tutors in the 18th century, to the suffragette and writer Frances Power Cobbe, who successfully campaigned for the college to become coeducational, to Harvard philosopher William James, who lectured in our library in 1908, to the writer and Nobel Prize winner Rabindranath Tagore, friend of two of our early 20th century principals, who frequently visited and spoke here in the 1920s and 30s, well, the 19-teens, 20s and 30s. So fast forward to 2021, when we celebrated with a lecture by Alan Rusbridger, former editor of The Guardian, the 200th anniversary of the founding of that newspaper, then the Manchester Guardian, in which quite a number of our students and some of the college's trustees had been involved in Manchester in 1821, wanting accurate reporting of the Peterloo massacre. So in a way, that lecture by Alan Rusbridger was a precursor to this series. Our senior tutor, Professor Leslie Smith, said, why don't we have an annual lecture exploring all those connected to our college's history? And all of us in governing body said, yes, that's a great idea. So here we are. And happily, the Manchester Academy Trust has generously provided some of the funding to support this lecture series, for which we are very grateful. So it's my huge pleasure tonight to welcome Professor Dinah Birch to give this inaugural lecture in this series. Dinah Birch is Emeritus Professor of English Literature at the University of Liverpool, where she also served as Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Cultural Engagement. She was, prior to her move to Liverpool, Fellow and Tutor in English here in Oxford at Trinity College. She has published widely on Victorian fiction and poetry and on the work of the artist and critic John Ruskin. Her books include Ruskin's Myths, Our Victorian Education, and she's the general editor of the Oxford Companion to English Literature. She's published editions of Elizabeth Gaskell's Cranford, Anthony Trollope's Can You Forgive Her, and The Small House at Allington with Oxford University Press, and she's currently writing a book on Trollope. She writes regularly for the Times Literary Supplement and London Review of Books, and was a judge for the Man Booker Prize in 2012. Professor Birch is an honorary fellow of both Merton College and Trinity College, and was awarded a CBE in 2016 for services to literary scholarship and cultural life. And I should just add that she was the unanimous choice of all fellows to give our inaugural lecture. So it's very fitting that this first lecture in the series should focus on the Gaskells. Their name is a constant through much of our history, and their support of the college can be traced from the late 18th to the 20th century. William Gaskell, husband of the more famous Elizabeth, was a tutor at the college in the 19th century and associated with the college in a variety of ways for some 44 years. And our college librarian, Kate Alderson-Smith, has created a wonderful display of books, pamphlets, and papers related to the Gaskells, which you can see in the college foyer. Professor Birch's title today is William and Elizabeth Gaskell, the Unitarian Making of a Novelist. And please join me in welcoming Dinah Birch.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you all this evening, and it's an honour to be speaking in Harris Manchester College, whose history is so closely bound up with the lives of William and Elizabeth Gaskell and the 19th century Unitarianism that inspired them. The most celebrated outcome of the marriage of William and Elizabeth is the body of fiction produced by Elizabeth. 6 novels, many short stories, still popular among contemporary readers and critics, regularly adapted for radio, television, theatre. Those who are interested in Victorian literature and Elizabeth Gaskell's part in its development will usually know that she was a lifelong Unitarian, and that as the daughter, then wife, of Unitarian ministers, her writing was underpinned by her faith. But they're not always fully aware of the depth of that influence or of the distinctive energy that it gave to her work. Elizabeth Gaskell was a pioneering writer in many ways, not least in her fearless engagement with controversy and her intimately detailed representation of the experience of provincial life. She was not a religious novelist in the sense that Christina Rossetti was a religious poet. "I am not," she once declared, "Unitarianly orthodox." Orthodox or otherwise, she was a Unitarian to her fingertips, though she was sometimes a restless presence within the extended networks of 19th century Unitarian communities in England, pushing against their expectations. Reflecting on her life as a writer reveals a great deal about what it meant to be a Unitarian, especially for a talented woman. But it also deepens our understanding of mid-Victorian fiction, where it came from, how it changed through the decades, how it located itself in relation to political and cultural movements of the day. 21st century readers are in no position to understand Elizabeth Gaskell's work without an appreciation of its formation within Unitarianism. To begin with the basics, what is Unitarianism? Or rather, what was it? For it is and was a dynamic faith, never fixed, always evolving in response to dispute and debate. Argument was the lifeblood of Unitarianism. Some things, however, didn't change. As their name suggests, the Unitarians did not accept the doctrine of the Trinity, nor did they accept the divinity of Christ, though most Unitarians believed in the divinity of Christ's mission, and others, like Elizabeth Gaskell, inclined to the Arian position that Christ was to some extent divine, but not equal to God. Many Anglicans and nonconformists claimed that the denial of Christ's divinity meant that Unitarians had no right to call themselves Christians at all. Charles Wesley's hymn, "For the Mohammedans," made his feelings very clear. "Stretch out thine arm, thou triune God, the Unitarian fiend expel, and chase his doctrine back to hell." Quite decisive, that. But Unitarians always identified as Christians, though they understood Christ's death on the cross as an act of self-sacrifice rather than atonement. Unitarians believed in an infinitely benevolent deity, and they rejected the concept of original sin and of eternal damnation. Those convictions tended to push them to the side of mainstream Christian communities. They had a sense of themselves as separate, not readily accepted in all social circles, everywhere spoken against, in Joseph Priestley's phrase. Many felt entitled to look down on Unitarians. That was one of the reasons for their concern to maintain respectability, their status and place in the world, creating a burden which bore down particularly heavily on Unitarian women. Elizabeth Gaskell shrank from any association with people or events that might be judged to be coarse, as she sometimes put it. Their sense of social difference gave Unitarians a particularly strong belief in the importance of mutual support in the face of the world's condescension or hostility. Leading Unitarian families, who are often wealthy and influential, stuck together and worked together, and they tended to marry within their own circles. But that did not mean that they were an introspective sect. Unitarianism was outward-facing, active in commerce and industry, and vigorously committed to the promotion of social justice and reform. It was a practical faith, focused on action rather than introspection. And Unitarians believed in the value of work. Elizabeth Gaskell saw her writing as serious work, never just a lady's pastime. So Unitarianism was an international movement with its roots in 16th century Eastern Europe. But 19th century English Unitarianism had a distinctive character, which became contested and, to some extent, divided in the early Victorian period. Joseph Priestley was among the most influential figures in establishing this identity. He was a brilliant chemist, the man who discovered oxygen, among other breakthroughs, and he was also a challenging theologian who moved English Unitarianism away from its continental origins in his emphasis on determinism, or necessarianism, as he called it, to be distinguished from the Calvinist doctrine of predestination as a product of natural rather than divine law. Necessarianism denied that human action could ever be a product of free will. All things, past, present, and to come, are precisely what the author of nature really intended them to be and has made provision for. But this did not, in the view of Priestley and his followers, eliminate the obligation to take reasoned action in order to amend the conditions that led to injustice. Individual moral and rational responsibility lay at the heart of Priestley's uncompromising model of Unitarianism. It was a pattern of thought that rested on a stout repudiation of authority as a sufficient basis for belief and action. The authority of the established church, of political institutions, or of settled social conventions could not serve as a basis for human conduct. The term dissenter might have been designed for Priestley, a man who questioned everything. But as time passed, his body of thought became in itself a kind of authority to be challenged in its turn. Among those who did so was James Martineau, born in 1805, the year after Priestley's death. Martineau, brother of the social and economic theorist Harriet Martineau, was born into a prominent Unitarian family in Norwich, trained as a Unitarian minister, served a congregation in Liverpool. Characteristically, he would not allow his flock to be called Unitarian, maintaining that they were individual thinkers, united only by their belief in the universality of God. Though Martineau claimed to dislike controversy, in practice, he was one of the most argumentative and combative men who ever breathed. He was profoundly influenced by Romanticism and disliked what he had come to see as the chilly rationalism of Priestley's Necessarian position. For Martineau, religion must be a matter of feeling. In a sermon of 1840, he asserted that worship is an attitude which our nature assumes not for a purpose, but from an emotion. This very unpriestlian understanding of faith marked a real division between generations of Unitarians. And yet Martineau had inherited to the full Priestley's distrust of settled authority. For him and those who shared his position, divine revelation must be received by the individual soul, not as defined by external authorities, but mediated by conscience and feeling. And he didn't entirely renounce Priestley's Necessarianism. Actions have inevitable consequences which cannot be avoided. Wickedness will be punished and virtue rewarded in an inexorable process decreed for our instruction and guidance. 1840 turned out to be a turning point in Martineau's life, for it was then that he took up a post of mental and moral philosophy at Manchester New College, the Unitarian Academy, forerunner of Harris Manchester College, that had moved there from its earlier base in York. So Martineau commuted to Manchester from his home in Liverpool, and it was in Manchester that he encountered the Gaskells. William Gaskell had become the college's clerical secretary and lectured in literature there, and he and his wife Elizabeth were at that point firmly located at the heart of Manchester's Unitarian community, where William served as minister of Cross Street Chapel, located in the centre of industrial Manchester. He'd been there since 1828. William Gaskell, born in the same year as James Martineau, was a Unitarian of a different colour, absorbed in his pastoral duties, interested in scientific discovery, perpetually busy with the teaching and administrative duties of the new college, and happy in his domestic life with Elizabeth. He wasn't hostile to Martineau's school of Unitarianism, though he didn't share Martineau's intuitive or even quasi-mystical approach to religious experience. William Gaskell had also been influenced by his extensive reading in Romantic literature, but he wasn't inclined to abandon Priestley's rationalism nor his Necessarianism. In 1878, 50 years after becoming minister at Cross Street Chapel, he preached an unequivocal sermon. Improper courses of conduct infallibly lead to mischievous consequences. Vice inevitably produces punishment, and virtue necessarily brings rewards and happiness. In the nature of things, it cannot be otherwise. If it might, the world would be a chaos without law, without order, without object, without anything intelligible or certain, a mere wreck, drifting blindly and hopelessly on to destruction and oblivion. His wife was inclined to agree. But William wasn't, in fact, much given to public polemic, and in any case, hardly had time to immerse himself in doctrinal disputes. His real passion was for education, which he saw as central to the Unitarian mission. Broadly speaking, he was content to pursue the rewarding and demanding life he had made for himself amidst the industrial bustle of Manchester, with its poverty and wealth, its hunger for spiritual and commercial progress. He was to continue his ministry at Cross Street Chapel until 1884. Elizabeth Gaskell was similarly divided in her response to these upheavals within Unitarianism. Her own background was overlaid with family difficulty. Her father, William Stevenson, had in his early years been something of a hot-headed radical, resigning his post as a Unitarian minister on the grounds that a paid ministry was wrong. Despite having worked as a tutor in the classics, he'd come to believe that a classical education, the indispensable mark of an educated Anglican gentleman, was a complete waste of time. In 1796, at the age of 24, Stevenson wrote a wonderfully uncompromising tract on the matter, remarks on the very inferior utility of classical learning. The study of Greek and Latin, according to Stevenson, led to an overgrown memory and a weak and puny judgment, a blind and bigoted attachment to authorities, names and antiquities, disputes merely verbal, and consequently the continuance of error and prejudice. That's a young man's polemic. But in later life, he subsided into a conventional career as keeper of the records at the Treasury, living in Chelsea, where his daughter Elizabeth was born in 1810. Elizabeth's mother, another Elizabeth, emerged from a very different Unitarian family, the Hollands of Lancashire and Cheshire, who were forceful, enterprising, and notably successful in worldly terms. Little is known of the older Elizabeth's life and character. She died just a year after her daughter was born, and baby Elizabeth was sent to live with her mother's sister, Hannah Lum, who had a house in Knutsford, later remembered in Elizabeth Gaskell's fictional Cranford. As a girl, Elizabeth Stevenson's life continued to be shadowed with loss. When she was 18, her beloved brother John, her only sibling, disappeared at sea, never to be heard of again. Motherless children and young men who vanish were to be a recurrent motif in her writing. Nevertheless, the energetic Hollands remained a lively presence in her life throughout her early years and long after her marriage, providing a very different model for Unitarian achievement. There was more than one way of succeeding as a Unitarian. In general, Elizabeth was inclined to favour James Martineau's ideas. She was certainly not willing to align herself with the inflexible priestlian concepts of Unitarianism. Like Martineau, she'd been greatly impressed by her encounters with Romantic literature, especially the poetry of William Wordsworth, which became an enduring presence in her fiction. A telling letter from Jane Welsh Carlyle, written to her husband Thomas in 1844, gives a vivid picture of the kind of Unitarian that Elizabeth Gaskell was not prepared to be. Jane had been staying in Liverpool and had attended a musical soiree there. Most of the company were Unitarians, the men with faces like a meat axe, the women most palpably without bustles, a more unlovable set of human beings I never looked on. However, I had a long, rather agreeable talk with James Martineau, the only being I could love of the whole nightmare-looking fraternity. Throughout her life, Elizabeth Gaskell, who was an attractive woman, cared about dress and indeed writes about the particularities of fabric and style with lively interest and affection. The grim version of Unitarianism that Jane Carlyle seems to have encountered in Liverpool was not at all to her taste, and she always distanced herself from it. Looking for a school for her eldest daughter, Marianne, she rejected one prospect on the grounds that it represented the very worst style of dogmatic, hard Unitarianism, utilitarian to its backbone. Like Jane Carlyle, she found the ideas of James Martineau much more agreeable. And yet, Elizabeth had her reservations about Martineau. She did not altogether take to his disputatious nature, nor was she greatly interested in the abstract theological issues that often preoccupied him. In 1859, she wrote in exasperation, "Oh, for some really devotional preaching instead of controversy about doctrines, about which I am more and more certain we can never be certain in this world." And she found Martineau's company trying. In 1853, during a much looked forward to holiday on Anglesey, she noted glumly that Martineau and his family were proposing to visit. "All the James Martineaus come tomorrow. They are at Pendiffrin. I wish they weren't coming. I like to range about ad libitum, sit looking at the views, etc., not talking sense by the yard." Elizabeth Gaskell was happy to keep her distance from theological arguments, but she remained largely in sympathy with Martineau's position, his romantic emphasis on feeling, but also his continuing attachment to a version of Priestley's concept of necessarianism, with its insistence that the consequences of wrongdoings are inescapable. These two perspectives combine and sometimes collide in her fiction. Like Martineau, Elizabeth was always inclined to emphasize emotion rather than reason as a guide to action. Miss Matty's faithful servant Martha puts this view in its fiercest form in Cranford, as she declares her loyalty to her mistress. "I'll not listen to reason. Reason always means what someone else has got to say." But reason sometimes meant what Elizabeth Gaskell had got to say. For all the depths of emotion that characterizes her writing, her fiction can be stern, stressing the social and economic realities of life, and on the price that must inevitably be paid for transgression. In The Old Nurse's Story, one of the strongest examples of her many ghost stories, the conclusion is characteristically unrelenting. What is done in youth can never be undone in age. Given her position as the wife of a prominent and exceptionally busy minister and the mother of 4 daughters, the fact that Elizabeth Gaskell had a high-profile professional career as a novelist is remarkable. Where did her determination and ambition come from? Unitarianism has a central part to play in answering that question. One important factor was the Unitarian understanding of the nature of marriage. William and Elizabeth were married in an Anglican parish church in Knutsford in 1832, 4 years before the Marriage Act of 1836 permitted dissenters to be married in their own places of worship. In this sense, the wedding represented a necessary act of conformity with the religion of the English state. In other ways, the Gaskells were prepared to accept some of the conventional values of marriage, where the husband would be at work in the world, as William certainly was, and the wife would take primary charge of household affairs and the care of the children, as Elizabeth did. But Unitarians were reluctant to recognize the inevitable subordination of women as wives. This was partly because of their firm belief in the importance of child-rearing, where the role of mothers was vital in the formation of moral character. Lant Carpenter, a prominent Unitarian social theorist, claimed that the education of infancy and childhood and much of the most important moral culture of the more advanced period will be derived, if obtained at all, from the female sex. The importance of education meant that the work of women mattered. If children were to be well taught, their mothers could not be ignorant. Only a seriously educated woman could fulfill her household duties to the family properly, and the family was central to Unitarian identity. In her book on household education, Harriet Martineau emphasized that point. For my part, I have no hesitation in saying that the most ignorant women I have known have been the worst housekeepers, and that the most learned women I have known have been among the best. Elizabeth Gaskell couldn't quite be described as a learned woman, but her education had been taken seriously. She read widely, she took great pleasure in novels and poetry, for the Unitarians did not customarily deny girls access to imaginative literature. As she grew older, her father took an active interest in her education. He made his views clear in a plain-spoken 1826 article for the Westminster Review. Women, therefore, ought to discountenance every kind of treatment and behavior which proceeds on the supposition that they are helpless, dependent, and frivolous, and that their thoughts and pursuits render them so, and bestow their approbation only on those men who regard and trust them as equal to themselves in their capacity for knowledge and usefulness. At the age of 11, Elizabeth was sent to board at a school for affluent young ladies near Warwick, later moved to Stratford-upon-Avon, run by the Byerley sisters. Unitarian by background, though their pupils were largely Anglican, and they did attend the local Anglican church. And her experience there bore no resemblance to what Charlotte Bronte endured as a pupil in the austere clergy daughters' school in Cowan Bridge, an ordeal that roused Elizabeth's indignation in her 1857 biography of Bronte. Elizabeth's school was not frivolous, but it wasn't overly demanding. Provided lessons in English, geography, history, French, drawing, music, and arithmetic. Arithmetic, I have to say, coming very much last on that list. She was popular. She earned the approval of her teachers. Her conventional school curriculum was later supplemented by what she learned in extended visits to family members after she'd left school. She was particularly influenced by the Unitarian minister and writer William Turner, an important Holland family connection. Turner was central to the intellectual and cultural life of Newcastle, and he advised her on her reading and study. Because she was a girl and not a boy, Elizabeth had no prospect at that point of attending college. Oxford, Cambridge obviously closed to her. But by the time she was married in 1832, at the age of 22, she was an educated woman. And she had married a man who cared passionately about education. William Gaskell had been a prize-winning graduate of Glasgow University, where he'd spent 5 successful years and acquired a very different education from that of his wife. There was much more emphasis on the classics, a discipline which, unlike William Stevenson, he loved, and on philosophy, mathematics, and physics. William's accomplished scholarship was not in the least incompatible with his religious commitment at Cross Street Chapel. He was an able lecturer, teacher, and in 1846 he became Professor of History, English Literature and Logic at Manchester New College, a post he held until the college moved to London in 1853, before finally establishing itself in Oxford and growing into the Harris Manchester College that we know today. William's work as a teacher was wide-ranging, and his pupils were by no means limited to the prosperous commercial and industrial communities of Manchester, the mill owners and the traders, the manufacturers, the millocracy, as they were termed. William was committed to the education of Manchester's working people, who were often living in poverty, precariously dependent on the trade cycles of the mid-19th century. When Manchester New College moved to London, William chose not to follow. Instead, he extended his work for Cross Street Chapel, continuing his tireless efforts for local philanthropic initiatives. He helped to establish a home missionary college designed to train ministers from the working classes. He served on the committee of the Manchester and Salford Sanitary Association. He acted as secretary to the Manchester Domestic Home Mission. He supported the District Providence Society while also pursuing his interest in literature by serving as chair of the Portico Library, a thriving subscription library. He was a busy man. Elizabeth took an active part in his work for the industrial poor, and what she learned at first hand from her experiences as a visitor informs her representation of workers' lives. And she taught regularly in Lower Mosley Street schools associated with Cross Street Chapel. Like William, she believed in education. But her most serious educational commitment took a different form. She thought she could best teach through writing stories. They were working in different ways for the same ends. Sometimes Elizabeth's work was explicitly associated with pedagogic purpose, as in her stories Hand and Heart or Bessie's Troubles at Home, 2 didactic tales she published in Travers Madge's Sunday School Penny magazine. Sometimes the association was more oblique, but the underlying connection was always there. Just as she actively supported William's work, so too William endorsed her career as a writer. The Gaskells' marriage was strong and loving, but viewed through the lens of modern expectations, it was unusual They habitually spent long periods apart. Elizabeth was attached to Manchester, ugly, smoky Manchester, dear, busy, earnest, noble working Manchester, as she called it, but she was not willing to spend all of her time there. She travelled regularly, at first in Britain and later on the continent, with her daughters or other companions. William would almost always stay at home. He took his holidays separately and would rarely consent to travel abroad, partly because he didn't trust the food. This might suggest a distant marriage, but marital behaviour of this kind was not exceptional among the prosperous middle classes of the early 19th century, perhaps less so in later decades. Women and children would often spend weeks or months visiting friends or members of their extended families, while their husbands would, in general, busy themselves with their own professional concerns and would only join them briefly, if at all. William was willing to allow his wife her independence. It's notable that Elizabeth's lively and very extensive correspondence reveals that she has other sources of support outside her marriage and family, particularly within female networks. Sometimes Unitarian women, or women who had been brought up as Unitarians and had later moved away from that faith, but not always. Her circle included Charlotte Bronte, an Anglican, Mary Howitt, a Quaker, the Winkworth sisters, also Anglican. Women's friendship and mutual support were necessary to her, and that importance is often reflected in her fiction, where female partnerships and households are a recurrent motif. It was at William's suggestion that Elizabeth Gaskell wrote and published her first novel, Mary Barton, A Tale of Manchester Life, published in 1848. That literary debut did not come completely out of the blue. She'd been writing for years, and a few short pieces had appeared anonymously. 3 tales were published in the short-lived Howitt's Journal of Literature and Popular Progress, a very high-minded publication, in 1847 and 1848. Libby Marsh's 3 Eras, The Sexton's Hero, Christmas Storms, and Christmas Sunshine. But a novel was something different. She wrote it at a difficult time in her life as she mourned the loss of her baby son, Willie, who died of scarlet fever in 1845. Her husband thought that the work required to write a full-length novel would distract her from her grief. The emotional intensity of Mary Barton, a dark story of conflict and loss, is in part a reflection of her state of mind, as she later conceded. Her sorrow meant that she was not fitted to introduce the glimpse of light and happiness which might have relieved the gloom. But it also reflects the dismay that she shared with William Gaskell over the misunderstanding and hostility that divided rich and poor in Manchester, and the deprivation and suffering that marked the lives of working people. Mary Barton was written with a strong sense of social purpose. I had always felt a deep sympathy with the careworn men who looked as if doomed to struggle through their lives in strange alternations between work and want. The more I reflected on this unhappy state of things between those so bound to each other by common interests, as the employers and the employed must ever be, the more anxious I became to give some utterance to the agony which from time to time convulsed this dumb person. In giving a voice to the workers, Elizabeth demonstrated the courage that characterizes her approach to fiction. She mixed with the prosperous middle classes of Manchester on a daily basis, as did her husband. And her unflinching account of the consequences of their indifference to the hardship suffered by their workers was hardly likely to receive a sympathetic hearing among her social circles. She was apprehensive, and like her early stories, the novel appeared anonymously. But the secret of its authorship was soon out. The book was topical, for the distress of the hungry 40s created a wave of literary debate. Thomas Carlyle's Past and Present, Benjamin Disraeli's Sybil, Charlotte Bronte's Shirley, Charles Kingsley's Alton Locke, and later Dickens's Hard Times. But only Elizabeth Gaskell was writing from the industrial North as an insider and as a woman who knew in domestic detail about the struggles of the poor. As she had feared, many were incensed, some in Manchester felt betrayed. Gaskell had tried to disarm criticism by confessing in her preface that "I know nothing of political economy or the theories of trade." That only made things worse. If she knew nothing of political economy, why did she feel entitled to write about relations between employers and employees? And why had she said nothing about charitable efforts to relieve the wants of the poor? Elizabeth was unrepentant, insisting that her aim had simply been to tell the truth, because evils, being once recognized, are halfway on towards their remedy. And William, whose life had not been made easy by his wife's sudden celebrity and indeed notoriety, stood by her with the calm loyalty that he maintained throughout the future controversies that Elizabeth's work created. After all, Unitarians had never much valued the approval of established authorities. The noise died down, as such bouts of public fussing do. But Elizabeth Gaskell's name was not forgotten, and Mary Barton turned out to be the launch of a productive career, not least because it drew the approving attention of Charles Dickens, who became a pivotal figure in bringing her work to print. His journal Household Words, launched in 1850, was designed for an aspirational middle-class readership. It combined entertainment with a focus on political and social issues. It was the perfect vehicle for Elizabeth's fiction, and much of her output was published in Household Words, or its successor, All the Year Round. Dickens and Gaskell shared many objectives. But Dickens found his contributor, his dear Scheherazade, difficult to manage. She was reluctant to comply with his editorial suggestions or instructions, and indeed sometimes defied them to his displeasure. Furthermore, her work was not entirely in tune with what Dickens wanted as the tone of his journal. Dickens had a serious purpose for Household Words, but he knew that he could not afford to dampen the spirits of its readership. "Brighten it, brighten it, brighten it," he once told his sub-editor, W.H. Wills, on reading an article that he thought dispiriting. But Elizabeth Gaskell was not always prepared to brighten it. Her persistent loyalty to a version of the old Unitarian doctrine of necessarianism inclines her to take a somber view of human affairs, and her stories are haunted by suffering and by death. Dickens thought this was a mistake. Writing to Wills of her story The Heart of John Middleton, which appeared in 1850 and which includes the death of its saintly heroine Nellie, he is disappointed by its mournful conclusion. I wish to heaven her people would keep a little firmer on their legs. The Heart of John Middleton is indeed a sad story, with Gaskell's characteristic ruthlessness in describing the desolating consequences of wrongdoing. But it is also a pioneering piece of fiction. It's a first-person account of the life of a working-class man born into poverty, crime, and ignorance. His bitterly vengeful character, softened and redeemed by his love for his wife Nellie and his gradual conversion to a forgiving Christian faith. The story is innovatory in its willingness to take working-class experience completely seriously, equal in terms of weight and complexity with that of the respectable middle classes. John Middleton is a far stronger character than Dickens's Stephen Blackpool in Hard Times, published 4 years later, 1854, with his baffled avowal that the relation between rich and poor is all a muddle. Middleton has a solidly presented intellectual history. Like John Barton in Mary Barton, he's often mistaken in his thought and he must suffer for his mistakes. But he is a thinker. In her novel, 1853, her novel Ruth, a forceful challenge to the sexual mores of her generation, Gaskell shows the growth of a supposedly tainted woman who has borne an illegitimate son, her growth into a devout, self-educated, and self-determining moral example. Ruth becomes a resolute heroine, not like Carrie Brackle in Anthony Trollope's attack on sexual hypocrisy in his 1870 novel, The Vicar of Bullhampton, not a helpless victim. However, like so many of Gaskell's central characters, she does not survive the conclusion of the novel. Ruth provoked controversy, like Mary Barton and Gaskell's subsequent industrial novel North and South, which was first published in Household Words in 1854 and 1855. Many were deeply affronted by its treatment of sexual matters. And some of Gaskell's female friends and supporters, like Charlotte Bronte, were sorry that Gaskell had entirely characteristically concluded Ruth's story with her death. Why should she die? Bronte asked. Why are we to shut up the book weeping? Elizabeth Barrett Browning was similarly regretful. Was it quite impossible but that your Ruth should die? I had that thought of regret in closing the book. This did not prompt Gaskell to retreat into comforting survivals. In Sylvia's Lovers, published in 1863, Philip Hepburn redeems his youthful crime in a life of selfless sacrifice, but he too must die. Gaskell called it the saddest story I ever wrote, and it is certainly a strong contender for that title, though it has several rivals. She never renounced her Unitarian conviction that sinful error might and should be forgiven and may lead to unforeseen good, but it would inevitably have destructive consequences. There was no escape. Nor did she swerve from her steady belief that the point and purpose of writing, no matter how difficult the consequences of publication might be, was to give a voice to the truth as she understood it. Her 1857 biography of Charlotte Bronte proved to be particularly contentious, and she was forced to withdraw unflattering observations about those she believed to have damaged Bronte's life when she was threatened by legal consequences. But she was not remorseful, though she made corrections where she'd drawn questionable conclusions. She had praised Charlotte Bronte's fiction as truth itself. And in the midst of the furore over her biography, she wrote to Ellen Nussey, Bronte's friend, "I did so try to tell the truth, and I believe now that I hit as near the truth as anyone could do." And it's here, above all, that she stands on common ground with her husband and with Priestley and Martineau and their followers. In 1858, William Gaskell had spoken of the purpose of education as to lay deep in the soul those principles of moral and religious truth which in all circumstances will rule the life for good. When it came to the pursuit and the expression of truth, Unitarians saw no justification for compromise. Elizabeth Gaskell was not a preacher, and indeed called herself a sermon hater. She wasn't chasing converts to Unitarianism, and the most morally upright fictional characters in her work are not specifically identified as Unitarians. But in her underlying principles, she stood alongside her husband as he stood by her. Her writing is a testament to the force of her staunch Unitarian faith. It was from first to last the bedrock of her fiction. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful lecture. And I think there is time for questions if anyone has a question. And there is a roving mic. Looks like there's about to be one just there. Catherine Robinson, yes, I think, just there. So, can you wait for the microphone?
The mic
and
is
then
arriving.
then we can hear you. That's great.
I apologise for a rather flippant question. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I never knew that Mrs. Gaskell wrote ghost stories.
Yes.
How does that square with her Unitarianism? Were they just pot boilers?
They weren't. She really cared about that strand in her fiction. She was interested in, as it were, Victorian adaptations of an older Gothic tradition. You see it in her very first published piece in Howitt's Journal on Clopton House, where she's really very engaged with that tradition. I mean, she saw it as a way of communicating with her readers. All of her ghost stories conform to those moral values that I've been talking about. But she also saw it as a way of increasing her readership, because they were popular. I think that was part of it. And as a way of extending beyond the parameters of domestic realism, if you like. She was herself, despite her rationality and her Unitarian commitments, not above a little superstition, and she was interested in folk traditions, which often, of course, touched on older ideas about spiritual presences, ghosts, if you like. And so she didn't see it as a contradiction with her Unitarian faith, but she did see it as a way of extending the popularity of her writing. And I didn't say much about that, perhaps should have done. She was keen that people should read what she had written. She was in tune with popular tastes.
Yes, Kate.
Thank you. Oh, okay. Thank you for a wonderful lecture, Dinah. My question's quite similar to the previous one. I always think of Elizabeth Gaskell as a very tactful novelist. And I'm thinking of a scene in Mary Barton where John Barton's been down to Parliament to try and advocate on behalf of the poor, and he comes back and it's been a total failure, and Mary, his daughter, serves him dinner, and she could question him about the trip and about his successful failure, and she decides not to. And Gaskell writes something along the lines of, she realised that there was nothing she could say that wouldn't be worse than saying nothing. And I wonder whether her tactfulness slightly tempers her absolute commitment to truth.
That's a very interesting question. I think you're right, Kate. I think that there are moments where she negotiates, as it were, without, I think, losing that underlying principle. But she wants a kind of relation with her readers, let me put it that way, which is perhaps rather more flexible than that which you would be pursuing if you were giving a sermon. I don't want to suggest by that she is simply inconsistent. I don't think that that's true. But there are moments in her fiction, particularly perhaps in her later work, where you begin to see, I mean, you've given an example from the early work, but I think you do see further examples of that in the later work, where you see that tact. Cousin Phyllis, for instance, which I haven't mentioned, though I think it's one of her finest pieces, and it has several examples of that. There's a scene, I'm sure many of you will have read Cousin Phyllis, where Farmer Holman, who's also a minister, a dissenting minister, is visited by two traditional old-school ministers as his daughter lies at the point of death. And they say to him, well, this might be a punishment because you've made an idol of your daughter. And Holman says at that point, with Christ I do not believe that my transgression will be punished by affliction. And Gaskell kind of on his side there, although the story as a whole doesn't, I think, depart from her underlying view that poor behaviour will have destructive consequences. But yes, she wasn't a preacher, and there are those moments in her work. I think that's right, Kate.
Hermione Lee.
Thanks. I just wanted to, it's brilliant. I wanted to follow on from Kate's question about tactics, because with respect to the life of Charlotte Bronte, when you have her saying, after she'd written it, I think I told the truth, or I think I got as close to the truth as possible. Of course, there are things she doesn't tell the truth about in that life. There are things she misses out completely. There are letters she censors. There's a possible love affair she doesn't talk about. There are people she doesn't name. So is she thinking about the concept of truth in a sort of general essentialist way? She's saying, I got to the truth of her nature rather than I told every single piece of truth about her life.
I think that's exactly right. And there you see the tension, which I touched on briefly, between her wish to be a novelist who would promote, as it were, the more respectable values of Unitarian. She didn't want, as it were, as she saw it, to compromise Charlotte Bronte's reputation as a lady by confessing to that passionate affair in Belgium, as we know, with Constantin Heger. She is not prepared to allow that into her narrative, though at no point does she, as it were, tell untruths about that. She simply omits it. So there is tension there. But she would argue, were she here, that doesn't undermine what she wanted to do in that biography, which was to demonstrate a different relation between a woman's life and her work from really anything that had previously been presented. And of course, from that point of view, it was a pioneering book. And many would argue that she got closer to the truth than other accounts of the life at the time. Though, yes, and certainly in terms of the way we think of biography now, it's a different model.
Sally, just there, if you wait for the...
Thank you. Yeah, it's a wonderful lecture. I've been pondering on William and his extraordinary industry.
Yes.
It's just unbelievable, the number of places he teaches, he preaches, member of the Sanitary Association, the Portico, etc. And I was linking back to, Jane, your discussion about the Manchester Guardian and the way in which that would have been so central to the House as well. And thinking that I think he set up his own newspaper as well, didn't he? The
Unitarian Herald.
And how that linked it, why he felt the necessity to do that, when there was the Manchester Guardian as well.
Yeah. Elizabeth Gaskell heartily disliked the Unitarian Herald simply because it took so much of William's time. And she worried about William's almost obsessive devotion to his duties, was always trying to persuade him, particularly in the later years of his life, to take things perhaps a little easier and to spend a little bit more time away from Manchester. I mean, I think that, it's hard to say at this distance, but I do think that William relished that constant activity. And I think, too, that it's not unrelated to a phenomenon that you do see elsewhere in Victorian men who were, how can I put this, conscious of their capacities and their scope for action. But there was something, I would agree, Sally, when you look at what he did on a daily basis, something almost pathological, really, in the way in which he worked from morning till night. It's certainly a pattern that Elizabeth found quite hard to live with. But it is part of the concept of work, that mid-Victorian concept of work, which you see in Thomas Carlyle, for instance, other figures in the mid-Victorian period. I've been thinking about it recently in the broader context of Anthony Trollope's life and work. He couldn't stop working. And it's not simply a matter of what we now think of as the workaholic. I think it is part of their sense of duty and obligation, but also of reward. That he did find the work, though rewarding, sometimes exasperating, but on balance, something he wanted to do. He talks about it towards the end of his life after Elizabeth had died in 1865, saying, I do sometimes think I should do a bit less, but then when I try to do a bit less, I find I can't really stop, so I'm just going on. But yes, it is a strange phenomenon. It's not unique. It's odd. But of course, he left an enormous legacy.
Last question, I think. Helen, yeah, great.
Thanks very much. That was wonderful. Thank you. I'm just wondering where you stand at the end of this in relation to the classic complaint against Gaskell by people who do find her wanting, which is that she, unlike her husband with all that industry, translates the big social problems, including war and hunger and the things that you talked about, the difficulties of relations between the classes, the split between North and South, that she translates them into personal problems in the end and doesn't give you systemic answers. So this actually the same criticism that Orwell makes of Dickens. Do you feel that you come out of putting her in that Unitarian context thinking that there is actually something more systemic here that goes to the heart of the religious thinking and the sense of where she sits within a culture. I'm thinking actually the implications of what you say are enormous for rereading Gaskell and taking her out of that rather patronizing tradition of criticism.
That's a very good question and quite a difficult issue, because there are those who feel that the, and I can understand that, you know, the personal frame of reference, which is always there in her fiction, and also the emotional frame of reference, that deeply affective, as it were, framework undermine what she wants to do. I think what I feel about that is that it represents a kind of deep conflict, a productive conflict, but nevertheless a conflict in her mind between her religious identity and her identity as a romantic writer. I think that the confluence between the individualism that she had identified in Unitarianism, which is a faith grounded in the individual, you know, despite that kind of framework of doctrine, it does constantly return to the individual. The conflict between that and the identity of the individual within a romantic frame, where it expresses itself very differently. And I do think Wordsworth is among the writers, not unique, but very central to how she thought about that conflict. Now, means that she approaches the social, political, economic issues that she's addressing from a very particular perspective, a particular angle. It's perhaps a little bit like the earlier question, what is she leaving out? And she is leaving out those larger economic forces. It's partly the texture of her mind. You see it in the letters, in fact. Now, when she writes about a conflict among her circle, her friends, she will always translate it into the personal, into matters of feeling, often within a romantic frame. But I don't think that erases the commitment to the religious perspective. It's a very distinctive voice, isn't it? You don't encounter it in the same form elsewhere. It's very different from the other industrial novels, if you like, of the 1840s. It's a powerful voice, but it doesn't do everything. It was inflected by her own experiences, of course, as everyone is.
Okay, on that note, we'll just bring the proceedings to a close. Before I thank Dinah again, I want to say a couple of things. The first is that our 2025 Manchester lecture will be on Rabindranath Tagore and will be delivered by Professor Shantanu Das, who's here, I'm glad to say, Senior Research Fellow at All Souls, and that will be in Trinity term next year. So if you were on the mailing list for this, you'll probably get an invitation to that, and we look forward to it very much. And secondly, everyone is very welcome to drinks in the Warrington Room after this lecture, immediately after this lecture, where you can not only get a drink, but also see a very fine portrait of William Gaskell, recently restored. But for now, I want to say thank you very much for this terrific lecture. Very appropriately given in this college, where we may be the only college where the PPists are told to read North and South before they come up. But you managed to bring together the politics and the theology and the novels and the fiction brilliantly in just the way that we hoped. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you.